Ideas are being debated today on a new, possibly fair and more sustainable type of economics. In this video, a few basic, general ideas on the topic. Liberalism, a political doctrine that considers protecting and enhancing the freedom of the individual to be the central problem of politics. Liberals typically believe that government is necessary to protect individuals from being harmed by others, but they also recognize that government itself can pose a threat to liberty. It fractures into a variety of types and competing visions from old and new liberalism. Private property and market order are central ideas. Private property is seen as uniquely consistent with individual liberty. However, the market is not always a self-regulated and balanced system, as we learned from the 1929 Great Depression, which was the longest, most widespread and deepest depression of the 20th century. It started with the stock market crash of October 29, 1929, the day we remember as Black Tuesday, and quickly spread to almost every country in the world. The Great Depression had devastating effects in virtually every country, rich and poor. Personal income, tax revenue, profits and prices dropped, and international trade plunged by a half to two-thirds. Unemployment in the United States rose to 25% and in some countries as high as 33%. Construction was virtually halted. Crops prices fell by approximately 60%. There were multiple causes for the first downturn in 1929, including the structural weaknesses and specific events that turned it into a major depression, and the way in which the downturn spread from country to country. In relation to the 1929 downturn, historians emphasize structural factors like massive bank failures and the stock market crash, while economists, such as Milton Friedman, point to monetary factors, such as actions by the US Federal Reserve that contracted the money supply. The even larger question is whether it was largely a failure on the part of free markets or largely a failure on the part of government efforts to regulate interest rates, curtail widespread bank failures, and control the money supply. Those who believe in a large role for the state in the economy believe it was mostly a failure of the free markets, and those who believe in free markets believe it was mostly a failure of government that compounded the problem. The US reacted to this with Roosevelt's New Deal. The New Deal was a series of economic programs passed by Congress during the first term of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, 32nd President of the United States, from 1933 to his re-election in 1936. The programs were responses to the Great Depression and focused on what historians called the 3 R's: relief, recovery, and reform. That is, relief for the unemployed and poor, recovery of the economy to normal levels, and reform of the financial system to prevent a repeat depression. The New Deal produced a political realignment, making the Democratic Party the majority, with its base in liberal ideas, in newly empowered labor unions, ethnic minorities, and the white South. The Republicans were split, either opposing the entire New Deal as an enemy of business and growth, or accepting some of it and promising to make it more efficient. The realignment crystallized into the New Deal coalition that dominated most American elections into the 1960s, while the opposition conservative coalition largely controlled Congress from 1937 to 1964. Historians distinguish a first New Deal and a second New Deal. Some programs were declared unconstitutional and others were repealed during World War II. In early 1937, almost no new programs were initiated because of the opposition of the new conservative coalition. The first New Deal, 1933, dealt with groups from banking and railroads to industry and farming, all of which demanded help for economic recovery. A second New Deal in 1934-36 included the Wagner Act to promote labor unions, the Works Progress Administration (WPA), relief program, the Social Security Act, and new programs to aid tenant farmers and migrant workers. With strident language, Roosevelt took credit for dethroning the bankers he alleged had caused the debacle. On March 4, 1933, in his first inaugural address, he proclaimed, "Practices of the unscrupulous money changers stand indicted in the court of public opinion, rejected by the hearts and minds of men. The money changers have fled from their high seats in the temple of our civilization." He closed all the banks in the country and kept them all closed until he could pass new legislation. On March 9th, Roosevelt sent to Congress the Emergency Banking Act. The act provided for a system of reopening sound banks under Treasury supervision, with federal loans available if needed. 3/4 of the banks in the Federal Reserve System reopened within the next 3 days. Billions of dollars in hoarded currency and gold flowed back into them within a month, thus stabilizing the banking system. By the end of 1933, 4,004 small local banks were permanently closed and merged into larger banks. During these first days, the New Deal created programs primarily for men. It was assumed that the husband was the breadwinner, the provider, and if they had jobs, whole families would benefit. It was the social norm for women to give up jobs when they married. In many states, there were laws that prevented both husband and wife holding regular jobs with the government. So too, in the relief world, it was rare for both husband and wife to have a relief job. This prevailing social norm of the breadwinner failed to take into account the numerous households headed by women. The first projects of the New Deal only hired men, but it soon became clear that the government needed to help women as well. John Maynard Keynes identified the causes of business cycles and advocated the use of fiscal and monetary measures to mitigate the adverse effects of economic recessions and depressions. His ideas are the basis for the school of thought known as Keynesian economics and its various offshoots. Milton Friedman's ideas dominated the second half of the 20th century and supported a completely different economic approach. He theorized a natural rate of unemployment and argued the central government could not micromanage the economy because people would realize what the government was doing and change their behavior to neutralize such policies. He predicted that Keynesian policies then existing would cause stagflation, high inflation, and minimal growth. He supported the conversion to paid volunteer armed force during the Nixon administration, served as a member of President Reagan's Economic Policy Advisory Board during 1981, and argued that many of the services performed by government could be performed better by the private sector. Naomi Klein studied how neoliberalism was affecting systems all over the world and collected the results of her research in The Shock Doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism. The book argues that the free market policies of Nobel laureate Milton Friedman and the Chicago School of Economics have risen to prominence in countries such as Chile under Pinochet, Russia under Yeltsin, and the United States, specifically the privatization of the New Orleans public schools after Hurricane Katrina. The book also argues that policy initiatives such as the privatization of Iraq's economy under the Coalition Provisional Authority were pushed through while the citizens of these countries were in shock from disasters or upheavals. There were positive reviews but also negative reviews. However, the book was awarded the inaugural Warwick Prize for writing from the University of Warwick in England. It is implied that some man-made crises, such as the Falklands War, may have been created with the intention of being able to push through these unpopular reforms in their wake. The book has an introduction, a main body, and a conclusion divided into 7 parts with a total of 21 chapters. Torture, according to Klein, has often been an essential tool for authorities who have implemented aggressive free market reforms. This assertion is stressed throughout the book. She suggests that for historical reasons, the human rights movement has often portrayed torture without explaining its context, which has made it frequently appear as pointless sadism. The second chapter introduces Milton Friedman and his Chicago School of Economics, who Klein describes as leading a movement committed to free markets even less regulated than before the Great Depression. Part 2 discusses the use of shock doctrine to transform South American economies in the 1970s, focusing on the coup in Chile led by General Pinochet. Part 3 covers attempts to apply the shock doctrine without the need for extreme violence against sections of the population. The mild shock therapy of Margaret Thatcher is explained as being made possible by the Falklands War. Part 4 reports on how the shock doctrine was applied in Poland, Russia, South Africa and to the tiger economies during the 1997 Asian financial crisis. Part 5 introduces the disaster capitalism complex, where the author describes how companies have learned to profit from disasters. She talks about how the same personnel move easily from security-related posts in US government agencies to lucrative positions in corporations. Part 6 discusses the occupation of Iraq, which Klein describes as the most comprehensive and full-scale implementation of the shock doctrine ever attempted. Part 7 is about the winners and losers of economic shock therapy, how narrow groups will often do very well by moving into luxurious gated communities, while large sections of the population are left with decaying public infrastructure, declining incomes, and increased unemployment. The conclusion doesn't recap the rest of the book. Instead, it talks about the backlash against the shock doctrine and economic institutions that propagate it, like the World Bank and the IMF. South America and Lebanon post-2006 are focused on as sources of positive news, where politicians are really rolling back free market policies, with some mention of the increased campaigning by community-minded activists in South Africa and China.